Now it's time for today's perspective on France 24. And Bill Gates insisting his use of a private jet isn't part of the problem when it comes to climate change. One of the world's largest oil producers hosting the next round of UN climate talks, or elites at the World Economic Forum in Davos, from King Charles to Jane Goodall, Al Gore, lecturing the public on the importance of tackling global warming. Just a few examples, if you like, about how the ultra-wealthy have reshaped the global discussion on climate change, pushing maybe, though, for solutions that serve their interests. Well, political scientist Édouard Morena's new book explores the theme. It's called Fin du monde et Petits Fours. Here it is, and he joins us for today's edition of Perspective. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. I mean, it does seem a bit of a juxtaposition, doesn't it, sometimes, when you see some of these rich and powerful people coming on and banging on about climate change. And you call it, if you like, green capitalism, don't you? What do you mean by that?
Green capitalism is a particular idea of what needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis, an idea that focuses a lot on carbon markets, or carbon pricing, but also that tends to focus a lot on kind of techno fixes and the idea that through innovation and new technologies we can solve the crisis. And finally, it's also an approach that centers on certain specific policies and that kind of attributes a particular role to the state as well in driving the low carbon transition.
I mean, on an individual level, I mentioned in the link there with private jets, which is the obvious thing which perhaps comes to people's mind. You think of the elite CO2 emissions in private jets, but you say, don't you, that 70% of the ultra-wealthy's emissions can actually be linked not necessarily to that, but more to their investments. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and I'm drawing on the work of a French economist called Lucas Chancel, who's really focused on that, and who highlights that there's a tendency to focus on the ultra rich and their consumption. So we focus on their super yachts, we focus on their jets. But we tend to also leave aside their investments, so where their wealth is invested. And what Lucas Chancel highlights is that if you look at that, you actually realize that the vast majority of their emissions are actually connected to their investments. And so I guess that was an important starting point for me when analyzing the super rich, because from the moment that their investments are responsible for the rising emissions, then that also generates an extra impetus, let's say, on their behalf to actually engage in the debate. And that's what I tried to do in the book.
Is this a bit unfair, though? I mean, presumably these people are where they are because of what they've done in their lives. And at the same time, surely they could be trying to do their best to combat climate change. It's not just, it's part of their program as well.
Yes, I guess you could argue that, but if you look at the history and if you look at the actors I study, quite a few of them are built their wealth through the tech boom, for instance. And if you look at the tech boom, if you look at the rise of Silicon Valley, you actually also realize that it was thanks to federal support that the Silicon Valley was able to rise. So they tend to promote this idea that they were self-made men, that they came from nothing, and it's this whole kind of narrative around them that kind of promotes this idea that they were. They built their own wealth through their hard work. But if you look at the reality, you realize that, in fact, it was actually thanks to government spending and involvement in the economy that they were able to do that. So I guess the idea is to also kind of break the myth of the entrepreneur that's also very closely associated with these rich individuals' involvement in the international climate debate.
I mean, going back to green capitalism that we were talking about just a moment, I mean, there are specific ways, aren't there, that you can argue that a lot of those wealthy people do actually benefit themselves from it?
Absolutely, they benefit from it, and at the same time, I think it's also important to acknowledge that I think they're actually aware of the risks associated with the climate crisis, the risks to the world. And again, I think the idea is not to say that they're just greenwashing or they're not actually concerned about the climate crisis. They are, in a way, concerned about the climate crisis, but they're also extremely concerned about the consequences of the climate crisis on their wealth and on their power, because the climate crisis will potentially lead to a devaluation of their assets, will also generate political instability, geopolitical instability. And so all these factors represent risks to them. And so their priority is to try and address those risks and to try and push for policies that address those risks while at the same time preserving their wealth and their power.
So when you see these, huge conferences that happen around the world, I'm thinking of Davos, I'm thinking of COP conferences, does it depress you? Do you kind of feel that what these people are saying is all part of this and actually they are either concerned for their own well-being or just set to benefit from it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend when we look at COPs over the past few years has been to turn COPs into these kind of spectacles, basically, where we've kind of showcased the efforts of the super wealthy. You know, if you look at COP 26 in Glasgow, when you see Jeff Bezos speaking there, you know, this kind of idea that, you know, it's a spectacle, essentially. It's about kind of putting themselves forward and reinforcing this idea that the super rich will save the world, essentially. So that, in a way, is depressing. But at the same time, if you look at what happened at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think I was actually quite hopeful because of the focus on loss and damage, because of the fact that, I guess, what COPs were initially for, which was about kind of getting countries together to try and negotiate, to try and address these complicated issues, and loss and damage is really a complicated issue. The fact that loss and damage was put on the agenda, the fact that we have, you know, it kind of reignited this idea that actually COPs are not just about the spectacle, they're also about hard negotiations between countries, and in particular about providing the global south a voice as well in the climate debate. And I think that's really important.
And at least, of course, you do hear from scientists as well at these events.
You do, absolutely. And I think they play that role as well. But I guess what's important is I think that there are two things. There's one thing which is to highlight and to focus on the climate science, to really insist on the urgency of the situation. But there's another, which is to decide on what type of transition we want. And I think it's important to separate the two in a way. I think that we need to, on the one hand, acknowledge the science, and the science is clear that there is an urgent situation, that climate change is man-made. But I think it's also important to highlight that there are multiple types of transitions that are possible. And I think that's I guess, one of my main critiques towards the super rich is that they've tended to bundle the two together, to bundle the science with their particular vision of the low-carbon transition, and to present that low-carbon transition as almost kind of a natural translation of the science into policy.
So
and I think that's problematic.
In other words, into something to suit their own needs.
Absolutely, but they kind of naturalize the policies that they push by presenting them as kind of a linear translation of the climate science, when in fact low carbon transition is a fundamentally political issue, and it's about deciding what type of transition we want and in the interests of whom. And I think that's really fundamental.
Great to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. Édouard Morena's new book, here it is. It's called Fin du monde et Petits Fours. At the moment, only in French, but he was telling me a minute ago he's hoping to do it in English at some point anyway. So look out for it in bookstores. Thanks very much once again.
Thank you.